done there?
We need to do what the government is doing, defining a national curriculum for teacher training, certainly in English and mathematics. That's vitally important. We need also to have the most rigorous system of school inspection. And thirdly, I think we've got to find ways of bringing in the most outstandingly good schools more centrally into the business of training teachers.
Now, you can send your inspectors into schools, and indeed, I think next week launching a campaign to send the inspectors into local education authorities as well. Can you go into teacher training colleges to make sure that what you've just said is happening?
We don't as yet have a statutory right to do that, and one or two teacher training colleges, universities, have been, shall we say, a little obstructive over the last 12 to 18 months. Now, the legislation that's going through Parliament this autumn will give us, we hope, the statutory right to do just that, and it seems to me absolutely right and proper that we do have that automatic right of entry. It's ridiculous if a university can say, we don't want to be inspected just now, come back in 18 months' time. Why should teacher training be in a different situation from any school?
Do you fear that the teacher training colleges are a sort of repository, as it were, for everything that's old and past and not constructive, not part of your revolution?
There are problems in teacher training institutions, but I wouldn't want to give an impression that every teacher training lecturer, every institution is working against what the government is trying to do. That's not the case. There is good practice in many of them. But when you read some of the articles, some of the academic papers that professors of education write, when you see how determined some are to criticise what the government is trying to do, then I worry.
And you want to sort them out?
Yes, I do. That's right.
One way of sorting them out, it's reported this morning, is that you and the Prince of Wales are in agreement about the need to train what is described as a super teacher. Well, that's common ground. Many people believe that there's merit in that. But to be trained outside of the colleges.
Yes, it's, to me, almost a statement of the obvious that the best way to learn the practical classroom skills that all teachers must have is to be exposed to the best possible teachers. On May the 19th, I think it was, just after the election, Ofsted, Office of Standards and Education, held a conference for the heads of the 200 or so best primary schools judged in terms of their inspection reports. And we asked those head teachers, well, what kind of contribution can you make to spreading good practice? And a number of them were interested in taking a much more central part in initial teacher training, and business and the community, one of the Prince's organisations, has organised a scheme whereby about 50 of those primary schools are going to take major responsibility for training teachers. Now that to me is a very positive step, because the student teachers will, as I say, be exposed to the best possible teaching.
But they would still be coming out of a teacher training college. This wouldn't be a new base camp for them.
They would be graduates who have got their degrees in history, English, whatever, but the year, the postgraduate certificate in education year, will be exclusively rooted in the school. It's not a radical, it's not new policy, it already happens, but for the first time we are gathering together a number of our very, very best primary schools, and for me that's the most exciting, innovatory aspect to the development.
Would you like, just to test you on that, me testing you, would you quite like to see then the idea that the young folk who are going to become our teachers of tomorrow do a first degree somewhere else, a university, a technical college, whatever it might be, and then go back to, as it were, the old days when I was an undergraduate, then they would do a postgraduate certificate, and they wouldn't be doing degrees like the B.Ed?
I don't think that the B.Ed needs to be radically questioned. The B.Ed does make a very, very important contribution to the training of primary school teachers. It offers that breadth of academic knowledge that primary teachers must have. The issue for me is, what is the exact relationship between the school and the teacher training institution in the preparation of teachers? What can each institution do best? And how can we draw into the teacher training experience the best possible teachers and the best possible schools?
When you look at results tables, you cannot escape the fact that the top 20 is dominated by the private sector. Now, those who send their children there are lucky enough to have the money so to do. What can we collectively learn from what the private sector are doing that the public sector isn't?
Wouldn't want to give the impression that I think the private sector's got it all right and the public sector's got it all wrong, because whilst there are some outstanding, obviously independent schools, there's also a long tail of independent schools that we inspect where we worry a great deal about the educational provision. But having said that, the best independent schools have got teachers who are brilliantly good. They are led by men and women of outstanding vision. They have created an ethos that is extremely positive, and it seems to me absolutely right that in the public sector we try to learn what is happening, more about what's happening in the independent sector, and we forge partnerships between state schools and independent schools so that teachers from state schools can go in and work with teachers in independent schools. Head teachers from independent schools ought to have more contact with their counterparts in the state sector. Those kinds of relationships ought to be developed with a great deal of energy and vigour.
Is that getting a constructive hearing in the government?
Yes, I think it is. I think the Minister for Standards, Stephen Byers, is positive about this. I noticed just before the programme that Margaret Hodge is writing in the Daily Mail, Sunday Mail, I think, on the same theme. So yes, I think that the Labour government is not writing off independent schools as ideologically suspect in some way, but is taking a much more pragmatic, common sense position and saying, well, what can we learn? What sort of partnership should we be seeking to foster?
You spoke at the conference yesterday, mainly about English and standards of literacy and what have you, but within that you also said, I'm not talking about the return of the dunce's cap, but I'd like to see a bit more good old-fashioned discipline. And you said in passing in that answer about the ethos of the private schools. Is it as simple as that it's about uniforms and politeness and yes sir, no sir, as opposed to, oi Fred, I've got my own work here?
Well, those things are not always simple to achieve, but they're fundamentally important, yes. Many, if not most, of the very, very good state schools that we're identifying in inspection do have school uniforms. All of them have got an ethos where the children know that politeness is the order of the day. When you walk down the corridor at break time or when the lessons are changing in one of these schools, you don't run the risk of being knocked to the corridor floor. So those things, for me, are absolutely essential. They're necessary conditions for learning. If the class is in a state of chaos and anarchy, then no teacher is going to be able to teach anybody anything.
But you know perfectly well from your experience that you may get a positive hearing from people like Mr. Byers and his boss, Mr. Blunkett. You may get a very positive hearing from headmasters when you go into individual schools. That's been shown already, even with schools that have got real problems they're prepared to try and help. Then you meet the local education authorities and the old Labour councillors, as some of the critics would say. Is that a bastion of resistance to what you're trying to do?
There are local education authorities, I think, that have still got one foot in the past, if not in the grave. But again, one must be wary of blanket criticisms. The situation is very different from one authority to another. We inspected, as everybody knows, Hackney a week or two back, month back, and the situation in Hackney was appalling. But earlier in the year, we inspected Barking and Dagenham, a local education authority alongside Hackney, and that authority is working very positively in supporting its schools. So what we want to do in inspecting local authorities over coming months and years is to identify what the good practice is in order to set standards for those authorities where things are not working as well.
What would you like to see then as being the key function of the local education authority?
I think there are two functions. One, there are certain services which need to be provided over and above the level of the individual school, but below the national level, like admissions, the planning of places for the children in the future, special educational needs. And then what's very, very important is the support that local authorities give to schools in raising standards. Now, it worries me when some local authority officers and elected members say that they should be influencing all schools, that their advisors should be replicating what the national system of school inspection does. That seems to me just a waste of money. But it is obvious that if a school is in difficulties, failing school or a school with serious weaknesses, that such schools will need support. Now, good local authorities, as the government's white paper indicates, will be targeting their resources on such schools and helping the heads and governors to make things better. And
finally, would you go along with the idea that it's easy to sort the teachers out in the schools, but it's the LEAs who you've really got to crack, and that is the biggest challenge.
No, I wouldn't say that. It isn't easy to sort out problems in schools. There are huge problems in some schools, but the remarkable thing is that we are seeing schools in the most difficult of socio-economic circumstance produce amazing results. There's nowhere for failing schools to hide now, and if we can keep the spotlight of accountability shining, and if we can find ways of disseminating good practice, then every parent listening ought to be optimistic about the future.
Great to finish on an optimistic note. Chris Woodhead, thank you very much indeed. Time now for the weekend weather prospects.
GMTV weather.